think the title of this particular program is Peace Possible? And I will be the optimist in the crowd. And the reason I say that I'm an optimist is because having worked on the issue of Arab-Israeli conflict resolution now for 40 years as a student, as a practitioner, and now as an academic, there is no inherent reason why this conflict cannot be resolved. It will require leadership. It will require the two sides taking decisions that are very hard with respect to their historical narratives, their emotions, their views about themselves and their peoplehood. But there are no issues here that are rocket science. These are manageable and resolvable issues. In fact, I start my classes at Princeton when I do teach the Arab-Israeli conflict with students who have not done this background, asking them to think about the question of narratives in the Arab-Israeli arena. In other words, how do Arabs see themselves in this conflict, and how do Israelis see themselves? And we write on a board in two different columns, and you end up with a mirror imaging of narratives, with both sides believing the same thing about themselves and their relationship to the issues in conflict, which suggests to you how hard it will be to bridge those differences, but also suggests to you avenues for communication and for possibly resolving the dispute. And they bring to the table a set of ideas about this conflict, which frankly are wrong, in my view. You hear such things around a table as, well, it's too hard, and we have so many other things to do as a country, why would we expend energy on trying to resolve this conflict? Or they bring to the table the idea of, well, if we try again, as we've tried consistently over the past 20 plus years, we are likely to fail, and another American failure will only, in a sense, give further justification for those who argue American weakness and American retreat. There are those who argue that the two-state solution no longer is viable, and therefore, since there is no easy plan B, let the parties figure it out for themselves. There are those who make the argument, which was stimulated by academicians some years ago, that the conflict is not ripe enough for resolution. In fact, this conflict is overripe. And if it got any riper, it would become more spoiled rather than giving reason for its resolution. So you face in this constituted community in Washington of so-called experts the idea that has now become pretty much the policy of successive administrations, going back to part of the Clinton administration, almost all of the Bush administration, and in some respects, even the Obama administration, that yes, we will devote some time and some attention to this conflict. We pay our dues in working on the Middle East. But in practical terms, we're not going to give it the kind of political oomph, the backbone, the determination that would be required to see through a diplomatic success. One of the complaints or analyses of our foreign policy over the past 20 plus years is the over-militarization of foreign policy. The idea that, what's the old expression, if you only have a hammer, then every problem becomes a nail. And we've become accustomed in our debate about foreign policy to believe that the only way we can resolve a problem overseas is through the use of military force. But consider the following. When George W. Bush entered the presidency in the year 2000, Iran had almost no centrifuges. When he left the presidency, Iran had about 12,000 centrifuges. Now, the policy of the Bush administration was to use the threat of force to try to bring about sanctions and to use coercive measures to try to force Iran to give up its nuclear pretensions. What the George W. Bush administration specifically did not do was to try diplomacy. In fact, in 2008, President Bush traveled to Israel at the end of his presidency and spoke at the Israeli parliament, the Knesset. And he equated diplomacy with Iran as a form of appeasement, which, as you know, is the equivalent of saying you are something of a traitor for even thinking about using diplomacy to solve this problem. Now, arguing for diplomacy does not suggest that it itself can resolve this problem or any other problem. But denying ourselves the capacity to bring diplomacy to bear on this issue is denying ourselves one of our tools of foreign policy. And so you've seen in the last 2 years on the Iran issue, where a combination of the threat of use of force and sanctions and diplomacy, combined with the fact that there have been changes within Iran itself, the election of Rouhani as president, has brought Iran to the table, has brought about an interim accord last November, which even those who opposed the interim accord when it was signed now recognize that it achieved all of its purposes and may still hold the possibility of reaching a full agreement with Iran by November, which is the next deadline. So I make this case in the Iran situation to point out that diplomacy is not only not a form of appeasement, but it is an incredibly important asset of our national power, which, if we use it effectively, and if our leadership has the determination to see through what we start, we actually can accomplish hard tasks. In fact, we ask our military all the time to do very hard things. And we expect them to succeed. They don't always succeed, but we expect them to succeed. And all I would ask of our president is that he ask our diplomats to do equally hard things. Maybe they won't succeed, but they have a possibility of succeeding. And in fact, if you look at the history of US involvement in the Arab-Israeli conflict resolution process, when we have had determined American administrations, we have helped bring about breakthroughs in Arab-Israeli diplomacy. In the 1970s, the Kissinger shuttles brought about both a disengagement agreement between Egypt and Israel, 2 disengagement agreements in fact, and a disengagement agreement between Israel and Syria, which held so well that it was the quietest border that Israel had until the 2011 civil war started. And the Egyptian-Israeli disengagement agreements, in fact, presented themselves as the foundation for what then became the second iteration of American diplomacy in this conflict, which was the Carter administration helping to shepherd the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty. And the third example was the George H.W. Bush administration, which I agree with Bob Hunter was the last administration in which we had serious adult supervision of our foreign policy. But I want to tell you why I think this is not just a resolvable conflict, but with American leadership we can actually make it work. Number one, if you analyze each of the critical issues under dispute, those issues that I mentioned just a few minutes ago, on which there were great divisions, in fact, what the negotiations between these parties have indicated over the years are places where an acceptable outcome may be doable. On borders, if you look now at the security fence that Israel has built to try to prevent incursion of terrorists from the West Bank and Gaza, a fence that was built during the course largely of my tenure as ambassador. It's a course that almost marks a security border for the state of Israel, and which in many respects Palestinians have already come to accept as the likely future border of Palestine. And that security offense includes the largest number of Israeli settlement blocks, the largest number of settlers. Do you know settlements is a huge problem in this issue? But since the fence already includes those borders within it, the number of settlers who would have to be moved in the context of a settlement gets reduced rather dramatically. So the borders issue is a resolvable issue. Security is a resolvable issue. One of the things John Kerry did about a year ago when he started working on this process was to bring John Allen, a retired American general, back into the game. And General Allen was asked to complete the work that General James Jones had started about 7 years ago of trying to analyze the security problems that Israel would face if it were to yield territory in the context of a political agreement with Palestinians. And Alan worked almost, I'd say 90% with the Israelis and only 10% with the Palestinians. Because his argument was that you can only make the case for Israel's withdrawal from occupied territories if you can also make the case that post-withdrawal Israeli security will be at least as good, if not in some cases better, than it was when they were holding territory. And Alan has made this case. It's not been made public, but he's analyzed the importance of geography and holding on to territory and the missile threat, the threat we now know of offensive tunneling. He's thought about future technologies that may be Star Wars-like now, but in other words, he's given an idea that security is not an unmanageable project in the course of a political solution. On the question of Jerusalem, Jerusalem can be the capital of two states. If you look at Jerusalem over the course of 20 centuries, did a seminar at Princeton on this question, and we analyzed Jerusalem as a political issue in the Arab-Israeli conflict. Jerusalem has never had defined borders. Never. And so the borders that Israel determined for Jerusalem in June of 1967, after Israel took the city when Jordan had attacked during that war, are borders that are open to revision. And they're open to revision on the same basis as may apply to the rest of the territories, and that is demographically based borders. It's an argument that President Clinton made back in 2000 when he basically said, what is Arab will be part of the state of Palestine, and what is Jewish will be part of the state of Israel. And your border that emerges from this is going to be squiggly. It's not going to be a straight line. And it's going to be an open border. There's an architecture firm in Israel that has done extraordinary work on how you deal with the complex problems of an open border in a divided city, a city divided into two sovereignties. For 5 years, I worked with Canadian diplomats at the University of Windsor on a project called the Old City Initiative, in which we defined governance arrangements for shared mutual governance in the disputed Old City. In other words, creativity and will can overcome even the problem of Jerusalem. It requires a catalyst. And I have argued since leaving government, as I did when I was in government, that the United States cannot fix this problem for Arabs and Israelis, but we can be the indispensable catalyst for helping them fix it. One way to do so now, for example, and I wrote this just 2 weeks ago in an op-ed in the Washington Post, is for the United States to put forward a set of terms of reference or a framework or parameters that capture the progress that the two sides have made in negotiations, that progress being beyond the current positions of the two sides, which forces them to think beyond their comfort zone, but also points them in the direction of where they have to go to get to an agreement. And if we do that, then we act with determination. The determination that Henry Kissinger showed in 1975, that Jimmy Carter showed in 1979, that George Bush and James Baker showed in 1991, determination that we can do as Americans, both because of our standing, because of our diplomatic power, and because of the power of a good idea. So I leave you with this thought that it is not kind of unrealistic optimism. It's not pie-eyed to suggest that the Arab-Israeli conflict, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, can be resolved. It can't be resolved if our reach is too short. So yes, there needs to be a ceasefire, and there needs to be arrangements for the rehabilitation of Gaza's infrastructure, and for the demilitarization of Gaza, and for access and open entry and all the rest. Obviously sufficient. Obviously necessary, but not sufficient. What needs to accompany a ceasefire agreement is a pathway towards the resolution of the underlying conflict, without which I think we're fated to have this discussion time and time again. Thank you very much.